Hello everyone and welcome over to iWay. We are joined today by four exceptional people who are going to explain to me how we can keep trans and gender non-conforming people safe in our society. I'm joined by Travis Alabanza, who is a wonderful artist. I'm joined by Shon Faye, who is a writer, HRH Princess Kuchenga, who is also a writer, and Nim Ralph, who is an exceptional activist who I'm so excited to introduce you to. So, guys, thank you so much for joining me today. I'm sorry it's so weird and it's on Zoom. I'll just do a wave. Would you be able to kindly explain to me and to everyone what exactly the GRA is?
What I'll do is I'll just sort of explain the basics of what we mean by the GRA, or the Gender Recognition Act. So very basics is that in the UK, every baby that's born has to be categorised legally as either male or female. You don't get to get out of that for any reason whatsoever. It's done usually on the appearance of your external genitalia. For even if the small number of people who are born with ambiguous genitalia, they still ultimately will have to, on their birth certificate, have an M or F. So that kind of means that for the rest of your life, you have a legal sex as it appears on your birth certificate. And obviously trans people exist, and intersex people exist. So this kind of process is designed without either of those two groups in mind. In the case of trans people, there was no way to change the legal sex on your birth certificate until 2004. And that was because several trans people had gone to the European Court of Human Rights and said that it was basically a violation of their right to privacy, that they couldn't have documents which reflected the gender that they were living in. And they'd have to out themselves every time that they tried to apply for a job, and had to show their birth certificate every time they wanted to get married or went to an official process. And the European Court of Human Rights found that that was unlawful and it was a breach of their human rights. So the Labour government in 2004 passed an act called the Gender Recognition Act 2004. And it provided a process for some trans people, not all trans people, but a certain kind of trans person, one who particularly went through a medical process, to change from, in a binary way, from male to female or female to male. And what it does, that process, is that it's a process where it's a judicial process. You have to apply to a panel. You have to get medical evidence. So you have to have been seen by a psychiatrist or a gender specialist. And you have to produce all that evidence, and you have to produce evidence that you've been living in role as your desired gender, which, when you think about it, how you prove that in itself actually requires stuff like utility bill, pay slips, which again requires you to have a job. So you have to evidence quite a lot of stuff. You've been living in a very functional way in role for the satisfaction of the panel. So that's the process you go through. And then when that happens, is that if the panel approves you and says you're man enough or woman enough for them to give you gender recognition, you become the other gender for the rest of your life, and you become that gender for all legal purposes. And that was a very progressive piece of legislation at the time in 2004, but it has now kind of been felt for a while, and other European countries and other countries around the world have adopted processes that are a lot less medicalized, a lot less requiring proof from a trans person, because I have been through that process. It's a very intrusive process. You have to produce medical reports from clinicians that are able to ask you pretty much whatever they want about all sorts, about your personal life, your bodily history, your sexual history. And it's just kind of felt like it's out of step with the modern world. And it also doesn't take into consideration any trans people who aren't trans men or trans women who medically transition. So non-binary people have no form of legal recognition. So there's been a proposed reform since 2017 to that act in order to streamline the process, make it less medical, and give non-binary people recognition. But unfortunately, that was, I think, initially hoped to be a very straightforward, and for Theresa May's Conservative government, a very cheap way to appease people and to get some good headlines on LGBT rights. But it turned into this massive controversy that's dominated the media. And I don't know if Nim wants to say more about that.
Sure, thanks, Shon. Yeah, so I think at the point that the consultation opened up, what we saw was this huge, unexpected backlash from particular sectors of transphobic feminists who used it as an opportunity to essentially create a national conversation about trans people's rights to change their gender at all, which is not, as Shon just explained, what that consultation was about. The consultation was about the process through which we could already change our gender legally. And initially it was just, I think it took everybody by surprise. It was like, where's this coming from? What's going on? And the rate at which they mobilized was phenomenal and terrifying. So very, very quickly, I don't think it's hyperbolic to say that in 2018, it was one of the fastest mobilizing parts of the feminist movement in the UK. And it was kind of wild. And the number, just the sheer number of people signing or going to the consultation, because they'd opened up this conversation based on fear. And so part of that mobilization and why it spread so quickly is they started talking about the fear that Jameela, you've talked about, this idea of the threat to women and children, which we know is a common trait in usually far-right groups who use it to kind of weaponize that fear against migrants, men of color, etc. And we saw that exact same tool like rapidly spread this conversation about trans people in the UK. And so we had this huge opening up of this movement. Yeah, it's wild. The speed at which that conversation has shifted in the UK is wild. The thing that's interesting about it, I think, is that actually they're very few in number. And I think it's really important as trans people and allies to remember that. They are very small in number. And like that, I don't know, like I think sometimes the monster in our head grows because of the threat, the size of the threat. But the thing to remember is that they also hold a lot of power. So what was really interesting, I think, about the consultation is, yes, they mobilized a lot of people to fill it in, but they were using it like a petition. So they were getting people to copy and paste answers into it, which basically, it's not how a consultation works. So although they had lots of numbers, it wasn't that useful. And we've seen that in the leaks that have come out of the government at the moment, around 70% of people being in favour. But what they did do, and what they were much more effective at doing, is, like I said, like kind of seeping into the cultural landscape, lobbying powerful people. They've got powerful ministers, they've got lawyers, they've got public spokespeople. They were much faster to get leaders of the women's sector to talk in support of their talking points. And so we've got this very small but very powerful group of women who've used this as an opportunity to open up a much wider debate. And so again, the thing about the GRA is, for most people, we don't really care. Most trans people, I should say, we don't really care. Like it does matter for the reasons that Shon said. Some people do want that, and that's important. The process should be less intrusive. But I can't remember the number off the top of my head. Very few trans people have accessed or tried to apply for a GRC since 2004. Why it's become so symbolic for the trans community is because it's opened up this much wider conversation about our humanity. And what we're seeing now come really to the fore of the conversation is that they're not stopping at the GRA. This is really about our other established rights and a conversation about our humanity. So we got a leak on the front of the Times a couple of weeks ago that suggested that the government might be considering a kind of UK version of a bathroom bill, which is entirely untenable, and I think would be smacked down in courts. And there's two things about that I think is important to communicate. As a trans person, I travel quite a lot for work. In the last few years, I'm used to moving through airports. I'm mixed race, I'm ambiguously brown. I'm used to getting extra security checks for an airport. In the last few years, that has become specifically random groin searches. And so this is something that already happens. It's something that I have to remind myself of your face right now, Jameela, that it is mortifying because it's become so normalized that I have to remind myself this isn't okay. It's traumatic. When it's not a random groin search, it's normally security guards having a loud conversation in front of everybody, but not with me, about which button to press on the machine. And then they usually make me walk through it 3 times anyway. So these are the kinds of things that something like a toilet bill will open up, and it will open up for all trans people, but it will open up for all cis people too, all non-trans people, anybody gender non-conforming. The only way to make a policy like this practice is either groin searches, or we start moving into the realm of needing to carry some kind of national identity card, which we all know what kind of path that leads us down. Any progressive person should be resisting that, or it becomes, it's just untenable, it's like unworkable. And so then the other question here for me is, like I said, most of us don't care about a GRC, a gender recognition certificate in and of itself. We've been kind of pushed into this cul-de-sac to have this fight because it's where we've been pulled into this fight about our humanity. And I think one thing that we really need to do is step back, stop looking at the individuals, particularly the ones on Twitter, and look at this systemically and question what's really going on here. And if we look at the government and what's going on with the government right now, there's lots of other things happening. And what we can see is that trans people right now, as we have historically been used as, are used as a kind of test case for the government. And we see this with Trump, we see it with lots of hard right governments. We're already dehumanized in society. We're 1% of the population. People don't know us to know that we're human. So we're very easy to turn into monsters. We become this test case of morality that the government can use to work out what it can get away with, and then transplant that into different spaces. And so right now, this government has made kind of noises or suggestions that they potentially want to open up the Equality Act. They've talked about a British Bill of Rights, and they've also hinted at trying to roll back the powers of the courts. And I think what we need to think about is why is this important to the government right now? Because it's not just because of this consultation. I think that we need to be looking at what's really going on there. And I would guess that this fixation on single-sex space that Liz Truss currently has is a way to open up the Equality Act, which was made in 2010. There's 9 protected characteristics, which includes race, it includes faith, it includes sex, it includes gender recognition, it includes disability, and so on. If she opens up to look at single-sex space, this government, who, let's be honest, can't be trusted to check their eyesight without driving for an hour with a toddler in the back of the car, are not going to stop at single-sex spaces if they open up that law. We know that they want a British Bill of Rights. We know that they have a regressive view on rights. What will then happen is we'll go to the courts, because that's our biggest protection against them taking away these rights. And what I suspect they will then do is use that as a way to position the courts as the liberal elite and the establishment, which will speak to their growing base within the far right and the hard right. And it will be used a lot like Brexit as a way to kind of polarize the nation and remove the rights of the court. And so there is a much bigger political game being played through our lives right now. And I think that we need to hold both those things together, recognizing that trans people are not safe. And the regression of these laws mean that it's not just trans people who aren't people. And there's a much wider, much more nefarious political game being played with us as the political football. And we need to be both watching the football and the game right now.
And also, you know, something that Monroe Bergdorf, who's a good friend of mine, something that she was talking about is the fact that for the last decade, is that right? People have been able to use toilets that are for the identity that they know that they are, that they believe that, or not that they are. So, right, so you had trans people using the same toilets as people who are the same gender as them. And there has been no emergency. There's been no surge in violence in women's toilets or women's protected spaces. There have been a minority, as in truly a handful of cases of historical violence from a trans person to a cis person or a cis woman in particular. And those stories have been repeatedly circulated again and again. I see the same exact stories and faces circulated again and again and again, and have done so for the last 5 years. There have been no new cases that they've brought to in order to fearmonger people. And something that when we've all spoken before, I was telling you about is the fact that, and the reason that I am so scared about what's happening is because I remember what it was like for me as a Pakistani and Indian person after 9/11. The way that post the September 11th attacks and post the 7/7 bombings, the way that the media in particular and powerful white people used the minority of stories about terrorists to represent the billions of Muslim people around the world, or billions of people even just who looked South Asian. We were all subjected to instant public attacks, instant instances of like ridiculous, extensive random searches. I still can't get through an airport in less than 3 hours because I'm subjected to all of my belongings, my underwear being gone through by men just because of the way that I look. So I've seen how fast that can happen. And we are watching this happen. We've seen it happen with every different minority around the world. And now we are seeing such a speed because of the power of social media in this being used to demonize trans people. in a way that I find very disturbing, and I feel it very necessary to educate, especially other cis people about, to tell you that this can happen to any one of us just via media manipulation and deliberate, egregious misrepresentation of an entire group based on a couple of individuals. Monroe was telling me that, you know, and she's been talking about this online as well, the fact that if we were to suddenly recreate this bill, or create a bill to make it impossible for trans people to use the correct toilet for their gender, or gender non-conforming people, we're going to start legislating around who can use what toilet, then that would, how would we even go about checking that? Would all of us have to lift up our skirts, cis or trans or gender non-conforming? Like, how do they, has anyone politically even said how they would go about enforcing that?
That it's a distraction, right? Because if they focus on these minority cases or these make-believe full arguments about trans people in, say, prisons, what it then does is distract you from the actual violence of said prisons, right? If they continue to talk about the make-believe theory of us being boogeymen in bathrooms, what they then distract us from is actually talking about gender-based violence. If they distract us and use us as the scapegoats to talk about us maybe appearing in domestic violence service places where actually we've been using countlessly for a long time, what that does is then distract us from the statistic that trans feminine people face higher amounts of domestic violence, right? So all of this is used as a kind of divide, and I hate using the word divide and conquer, but it really feels like that, right? Because it actually feels relevant to use colonial language in a thing about gender. And actually what it does is it divides and conquers us to then continue to stay oppressed and divided, when actually if we listen and center trans politics, center trans liberation, what that will do is see greater liberation for all marginalized people, right? Because when we're looking at these things such as violence of prisons, when we're looking at these things such as violence against sex workers, when we're looking at these things such as domestic violence, if we actually centered trans women, trans feminine people, instead of making us the problem, we'd actually get to the core of the people that are experiencing the issues at higher amounts.
I think it's really important to underline that we're at this current political moment because of Black feminist theory. And it's as a result of Black feminists that we have been given the terminology and the language to speak about the matrix of domination. You know, thank goodness for bell hooks, you know, highlighting for so many decades what it's like to live under imperialist, capitalist, white supremacist patriarchy. And when we're looking at the disproportionate amount of Black trans women who are suffering from so much violence, it's because we are at this particular intersection under a matrix of domination. So we experience so much. I feel sometimes people are like, think that when we're talking about centering Black trans women in our political work, that is, you know, some sort of vanity project, whatever. This is actually really efficient. If we look to the most marginalized in society and look to improve their lives, we raise all shit. In terms of what this moment has meant for me, I am hanging on by a thread to my reading and certain platforms. I have to shout out For Harriet, Kimberly Foster, YouTubers like Adrian Expression, you know, who are just such strong cis allies and, you know, are grounding themselves in the work of others. There is this real interdependency amongst Black political people in the public sphere. And yeah, I'm just so grateful for them. And I can also see how this is fueling so many people like Marsha's Plate, the podcast that comes out of Houston, Texas, with Diamond Styles and Mia and Z. And, you know, week after week, you know, doing the grunt work, you know, like having a space where we're able to speak about the lives of those who've been taken. You know, for me as a Black trans woman, having Black trans people have the space to grieve publicly is so important. And so yeah, I just have to thank those sorts of people who are not getting any sort of shine and are, you know, really, when we talk about what grassroots work involves, it's that quiet plodding, you know. And so I feel like Black feminist theory really encourages that you know, that we're in it for the long game. You know, so these, like, you know, flash reading lists that have been given out over the past 6 weeks, you know, that have been there for a really long time. And I question, who's holding people accountable? Are people actually reading these books? You know what I mean? Like, I'm worried that, you know, Renieto Lodge and Robin DiAngelo, these books are being bought and are just sitting there on coffee tables, you know, to like, yeah, further your woke, it's like kind of what a woke performativity. And
the allyship cookie.
exactly. So I have to temper my expectations and mitigate what, you know, is being discussed with, like, you know, my understanding of what it's like to live with white liberal promises that turn out to be quite shallow and empty. So yeah, I'm not feeling particularly buoyed up, and, you know, the fact that there have been so many more Black trans women being murdered, you know, particularly during Pride Month and everything, it's not just sobering, it's not just dispiriting, it's left me feeling quite crushed.
Can you please tell me how allies like myself and other allies out there, or other young trans people, gender non-conforming people, or their parents can get together and support your work? Shon, would you start? Just tell us what we can do to make sure that these rights are not taken away from these communities.
So I think there's two things here. So the first thing to say is, given what we said about the GRA not always being the priority of trans communities, is right now the GRA doesn't govern spaces. It's to actually, one thing people can really do in the UK in particular is donate money and support trans organisations that provide inclusive services. Because, for example, we know that 24% of youth homelessness are LGBT, and AKT, a charity in London, based in London, that deals with youth homelessness, says that trans people are overrepresented, and BAME trans people of colour, young people are overrepresented in the people that they see. So donating to organisations like that, because these people have already often lost their families and been kicked out on the street, and there are not inclusive services often that work for them. So providing resources for the most vulnerable trans people when there's a constant threat about gender policing in spaces is a huge thing. Obviously, on the legislative side, the fear about rights being rolled back, there is all the stuff, the good sort of fashion lobbying stuff, like writing to your MP. I think it's that sort of stuff is being really targeted. Don't waste time arguing with people on Twitter. Like, write to your MP, find out who the decision makers are in your local community, see about how you can be making the spaces around you inclusive of trans people. And actually that sort of stuff about building stuff, it's like what Kuchenga said about the plodding, is as important as the hashtags and the online stuff, just because we've had 3 years of that and it hasn't made a huge difference, to be blunt.
Thank you. And Nim, as an organizer yourself, can you tell us how we can support your work, and if there is a particular space or a couple of spaces where you feel like we could all pour into to be able to, as an online space, to be able to find all the resources that we would need to be able to support all?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of what Shon just said is some of the stuff I was going to say, so thanks, Shon, you made my job easier. I think, so something I would say is that Gendered Intelligence is a really awesome project in London, and they have a page on their website called Campaigns that has like a template letter to your MP, so they make it super easy, just to lift that up again. Phoning your MP, however, is a much better and more direct way to contact people. I know that everybody our age and younger is terrified of making phone calls, but do it for the trans people. I think
they want to be able to slide into a DM,
right? Something that I think is important is that often I get asked this question all the time, and it comes from this place of wanting to do something. And because of the intersection of social media and the internet with our lives, often what people want is an easy answer. There are steps you can take that are easy. So I can tell you, go to this website, it's got a form for you to fill in and it will email your MP for you. It makes that easy. But really the work of being an accomplished, being an ally isn't easy. It's not easy. And that's why it's so hard to mobilize people to support us. And Kuchenga used this beautiful phrase earlier, and I've forgotten exactly what it was, but it was something about the slow steps to change, or something along those lines. And I think one of the things that this, I was saying, social media has made it like simplified the ways we think about taking action. And one of the things that the system does to all of us is make us feel disempowered. And what social media, I think, has layered on top of that is that we all want to be shouting the big systemic words. We want to be like showing that we understand the whole system. And then we get this disconnect between doing something in service of other people and having people know that we understand the system. And really, most of what allyship is the small things you can do around you. And so one of the biggest things I think you can do as an ally is recognize your own power. What power do you have in your life? And it might be the power to have a conversation with Aunt Karen. And we need allies to do that work, because otherwise we end up doing it. And I spend so much of my time in conversations like that, and it takes so much more from me than just from somebody who isn't trans. It might be that you work in a space that has a toilet in it, so use your power to lobby for the toilet. It might be that you work in a shop that genders its clothes unnecessarily. It might be that you have meetings on Zoom and you can ask people to put their pronouns into their Zoom names. We have power everywhere around us. And so one of my biggest things is like, where is your power? And you use it. And then something that whole conversation you were just having was making me think about is one of my mantras to myself is that I spend so much time of my life as an activist resisting. But the problem with that mindset is it often means that you're being reactive, or you're always seeing what's lacking. And so one of my daily mantras to myself is, I chose joy over safety. And if I chose joy over safety, I have to find some fucking joy. And so one of the other things I would say is, which speaks to the conversation you've just been having, is don't just amplify the voices of, or the narratives that we've been talking about trans murder, trans, like the horror, the awfulness. Find stories of trans joy. Amplify those stories, because they're the things that, number one, will help our young kids coming out and looking up to us, but they'll also help us. And we need to centre more of that in our work. And I think the lack of organising infrastructure that Travis was talking to in the UK means that we don't have structure for joy a lot of the time. And so one of the things I try to do in my work is work out, how do we find trans joy in all of this? So that's the other thing I would say.
I think, sparking off the joy, when are you giving attention to trans people, particularly the Black trans people in your life? And, you know, the fact that I'm actually sat next to an incredible writer, Kuchenga, and I'm thinking about, when do we give attention to actually funding, allowing, and making space for writers such as Kuchenga, but also I'm thinking about Tourmaline, who put on her Instagram, I don't just want Black students trans like lives to matter, I want them to flourish, I want them to be in excess. Sorry if I've butchered that quite, but I think it was kind of like that. And what I was thinking about with that is, don't just fund us for our reaction. The joy, then go on, fund us to like have, Kuchenga said, her dream of having a long, healthy life. And that includes us being able to work. It includes celebrating our writing, whether or not it's about us being trans or not. It includes platforming our craft, because I guarantee you, when you start seeing more of us being able to write our novels, or being able to be in the fashion industry, or being able to be chefs, or being able to be whatever we want to be, you'll see more young Black trans people starting to harness their joy too. Because you best believe that when we get in those spaces, because we're so used to being shut out, we put a brick in and let the whole doors come through with us. So I think it's about, sometimes what I saw in this resurgence of gaze on us from white people, right? G-A-Z-E, not G-A-Y-S, but both relevant, is that it was so reactionary to our violence that it then, the GoFundMes and the crowdfundMes about us finishing our work or us creating something outside of them weren't able to exist. So I want to further Nim's point and say, it's not just about us looking for joy, it's about you using our power to let us find our joy too, because it has been shut out by you. And so we actually need you to give up all that space so that we can find it with or without you.
That was really beautifully said. And Kuchenga, HRH, Princess Kuchenga, do you have anything to add for allies out there who are listening to this and understanding more, finally, the actual correct information about this cause?
Yeah, absolutely. Open your purse. It's about funding the abundance. What I would love from this conversation is to hear that the Patreons of the grafters, like the YouTuber Cat Black, who just does the daily work, you know, educating and informing with so little, you know, with so little attention, so little attention is given to her. Also, Monica Roberts, the trans griot, also coming from Houston, Texas. There's something in the water down there, you know what I mean? Not only Marsha's plate, but Monica Roberts, plus Memphis Alien, and Beyonce. Anyway, but yeah, basically, that is just such an important, you know, source of information and support for our community. Also fighting against the respectability, you know, the fact that, you know, so many of us have had to do survival sex work. You know, T.S. Madison, oh my God, she's really kept me going over the years and, you know, really helped me to, you know, destigmatize, you know, a lot of the choices that I've had to make in order to get through in life. The Tea Time Network, you know, Ashley Breed, one of the co-founders, on Instagram and on YouTube, such an archive of gorgeous, yeah, a resource of like Black trans voices speaking about our lives. There's so much to say. And also, I really have to say to white allies, what's being asked of you in the current moment is to become scholars of whiteness. You know, at the end of the day, you know, talking about white supremacy is really going to help. Like, we need to like understand what the pernicious impact of, you know, the past 500 years has been on humanity. So, you know, that's the Robin DiAngelo's, that's the Jane Elliott's, the Tim Wise's. There's also the article, Whiteness on the Couch, looking at the impact of white supremacy on the white psyche. That is, yeah, just absolutely fundamental. But also, in terms of literature, The Vanishing Half, Fred Britt Brennett, yeah, she is just such a phenomenal author. And there's a beautiful trans story in that book, which I was so touched by, and I'm really grateful for her for writing that book specifically, about passing of regards to gender, but more with race also. And also redefining wellness. If you are an ally and you really want the trans 101, then you better pick up the best piece of life writing that I've ever read. You know, Janet Mock is such an incredible writer and a beautiful rhetorician. And if you need proof of that, you need to listen to her speech at the Essence Awards, where she spoke, you know, honoring Black girls and talking about Black girls being worthy. Really changed my whole perspective. So yeah, I think, is that enough?
That's plenty. I agree. I think that everyone's raised really important points. Please educate yourselves and do that by following the wonderful educators over on iWay. We are constantly letting you know of wonderful people and organizers and artists and writers and activists that you should follow within these spaces. And so I really want you to follow those people, help fund those people, highlight the best stories about their lives rather than only the saddest and scariest stories. So when you are showing support for the murders and crimes that happen against that community, I understand that, and I think that that's important. We need to raise awareness. There hasn't been enough awareness raised even in the last year, but we also need to show off trans and gender non-conforming joy and flourishing and beauty. So gendered intelligence is something that we all need to be paying attention to, and we can go on there to find out how to support people and actually work towards legislative protection for this community. And just keep doing the work. There is so much that I've even learned in this conversation. Thank you all so much for telling me about your experiences, and continue to learn from others. We have so much work to do as cis people to educate our own and just create not just legally safe spaces, but emotionally safe spaces for people within this community, because all they're trying to do is survive. They're not asking for anything other than basic equality. This isn't about revenge. This isn't about taking feminism away from white feminists. It's just about actual true feminism, which is equality for all. That's all feminism is. It's just social and political and financial and economic equality. That's all we should be looking for as human beings. And so I feel very strongly about this. Thank you so much for educating me. I'm sure that we will speak many more times again on this platform. There's so much more to be said, but regarding what's been dominating the headlines recently, I appreciate you clarifying that for all of us and for explaining to us how that is just a diversion tactic used to not only take away your rights, but then take the rights away from other marginalized groups once they have successfully deconstructed your ability to just exist. So thank you so much, Nim, Shon, HRH Princess Kuchenga, and Travis Alabanza. I really appreciate you so much, all of the kisses. And I will be instructing underneath this video where you can find all of these brilliant people. So thank you.